In the year 3092, humanity finally solved its most stubborn crisis: trash. With landfills overflowing, oceans toxified, and recycling deemed too boring by the Global Council, a radical solution emerged: time travel garbage disposal. Thanks to forbidden quantum black hole technology, Earth's filth could now be catapulted into the past. Ancient civilizations, it was reasoned, had no digital records or environmental review boards. Problem solved. Orbiting this polluted Earth was the Filth Falcon, a decommissioned cruise liner turned intertemporal waste freighter. It was crewed by the ChronoComposters, a team of underpaid, over-caffeinated sanitation renegades whose job was to launch today's trash into yesterday's laps. They weren't heroes. They were barely functional, but they had the only working chrono-ejector in orbit. Everything was going smoothly, if you ignore the occasional dinosaur mutation or Trojan horse filled with microwave burritos, until garbage drop number 8729. Destination: ancient Rome. Payload: 4 metric tons of irradiated banana peels, holographic fast food containers, and bioreactive slime from the Neptune outpost. During the drop, a minor oversight occurred. The containment gel hadn't been properly secured, and when the trash tube opened, a pulsating green ooze seeped into the ship's chronometer. The resulting temporal feedback loop didn't just eject trash. It infected time itself. Suddenly, alerts blared across the Filth Falcon. Systems overloaded. The trash hadn't dispersed into the Roman past. It had fused with it. Something ancient had changed, and the timeline trembled. From their control deck, the ChronoComposters saw a terrifying glitch ripple through history. Vines erupting in ancient Rome, compost storms in medieval villages, laser cacti duels in the Martian Wild West colonies. The trash had evolved, and it was alive. Their mission was no longer to dump garbage. It was to stop the greatest horticultural disaster in the history of time. The first stop in their corrective journey was Rome, circa 54 BC. But it was no longer the Rome from history books. It had been reshaped, infested by mutated flora. Gigantic Venus flytraps roamed the streets, gobbling up gladiators. Olive trees had grown sentient, refusing to produce oil unless properly worshipped. The Tiber River bubbled with compost juice. Historians would have wept, but the ChronoComposters didn't have time for tears. Arriving above the city in stealth mode, they deployed their bioscan drones to locate the source of contamination, the Imperial Garden. Originally a peaceful grove for Roman nobles, it was now a churning hub of mutated chlorophyll, emitting spores that rewrote DNA faster than a political scandal. These spores were aggressive. They didn't merely adapt. They conquered. Every plant, flower, root, and vine had begun evolving exponentially, drawing strength from a single corrupted seed, a chrono-infused banana peel from the garbage drop. This peel had taken root beneath the garden and twisted nature into a new empire. To contain the spread, the crew launched atmospheric neutralizers, which began converting airborne compost into inert carbon threads. The effect was immediate, but so was the retaliation. Vines as thick as ships burst from the ground, lashing out at the intruding technology. Leaves turned to blades. Flowers snapped like steel traps. From the rooftops, citizens screamed as their aqueducts turned into moss-choked tentacles. The Colosseum, once a battleground for men, was now a coliseum of chlorophyll. Inside, mutated gladiolus plants dueled with Roman soldiers, whose armor had started sprouting dandelions. Realizing brute force wouldn't suffice, the ChronoComposters rerouted their focus underground. Through seismic scans and quantum layering, they located the neural core of the timeline seed, a pulsating organic mass that throbbed beneath the arena floor like the beating heart of a vengeful garden god. Initiating a temporal cleanse required risky temporal engineering. Using the ship's onboard entropy stabilizer, they isolated the contaminated quantum strand and inverted its frequency. But they only had one chance. If the strand snapped, they risked turning Rome into a prehistoric jungle, permanently. The cleanse initiated. A shock wave burst through the Colosseum. Statues reverted from leafy tributes to their original marble forms. The olive trees gave up their sentience and resumed their silent, oily duties. The flytraps collapsed into heaps of pulp, and Caesar himself, who'd briefly merged with the consciousness of sentient grapevine, fell to the ground, dazed and mortal once more. The garden was gone. The timeline stabilized. But the seed's corruption had already spread to other pockets of history. The ChronoComposters barely had time to process what they'd witnessed before the ship alerted them to the next temporal bloom. Time tore open again, pulling the Falcon toward 13th century England. Their scanners picked up a new anomaly, a biomutated storm cloud hovering above a medieval castle, raining compost so acidic it melted through stone. Something in the past was fermenting fast, and history was starting to reek. The ChronoComposters materialized in the middle of a medieval village. Hay carts lay overturned, villagers fled from vegetable golems, and knights in dented armor jousted with overgrown dandelions the size of carriages. A moat had turned into a bubbling soup of sludge, where croaking frogs now emitted bioluminescent gas. At the heart of the chaos stood Castle Grizzlethorpe, now completely overrun with animated compost creatures. These entities were no longer just mutated plants. They were sentient, coordinated, and evolving their own strange society. Compost monarchs ruled over mulch peasants. Fungus towers sprouted diplomatic flags, and the air was thick with pollen manifestos. The crew's analysis showed that a misfired trash drop, intended for a nearby black hole, had instead opened a micro-wormhole directly into the castle's wine cellar. The barrels had fermented with bioreactive waste, producing a hybrid entity known as the Spore King. This fungal overlord had merged with the ancient castle's root system and begun growing across the countryside. Using cloaking gear fashioned from cloaks, actual ones, the ChronoComposters infiltrated the castle's inner walls. They had to move quickly. The Spore King was preparing to spore cast across all of Western Europe, turning monarchies into mulcocracies. Inside the main hall, they found the core, a throne of moss and mold wrapped around the decomposed skeleton of the castle's former ruler. The air shimmered with spore particles, each carrying temporal instability. Every breath risked corruption. They initiated a deep decomp cleanse, deploying targeted flame drones to incinerate excess growth while funneling spores into temporal vacuums. But the Spore King resisted. It erupted from the throne in a burst of animated decay, flailing roots like whips and releasing hallucination pollen to confuse the crew. The battle was long, sticky, and surprisingly philosophical. The Spore King believed decomposition was the ultimate form of democracy. All things must rot to be equal. But the ChronoComposters weren't there for metaphysics. They overloaded the entropy stabilizer with a hypercharged compost loop, triggering a reverse bloom that imploded the fungal regime. When the smoke cleared, the castle had reverted to its stone and ivy origins. Knights blinked at their cleaned armor, wondering why they were covered in flower petals. History was back on course. Their next journey hurled the Falcon not just through time, but across space toward a terraformed Martian outpost in the year 2193. It was once known as Frontier 9, a Wild West-themed mining colony turned tourist trap. Now, it was a war zone, overrun not by outlaws, but by weaponized cacti. The ChronoComposters arrived to find the red sands dotted with ghost towns, tumbleweeds the size of cattle, and saloons barricaded with sandbags. A local distress beacon played an old Earth jingle on loop, a twangy rendition of Dust in the Wind. Analysis showed the source. A shipment of decorative cactus plants imported from Earth had fused with a misplaced time rot canister, intended for decomposition studies. The result was an aggressive genus of cacti that had developed not only mobility but military strategy. They wore cowboy hats, carried laser pistols grown from crystallized sap, and had established martial law under their fearsome leader, General Spikeworth. The cacti had taken offense to the town's theme, declaring it a mockery of desert culture. They had rebranded the colony Cactus County and exiled all non-succulent life forms. The crew infiltrated a saloon-turned-resistance bunker, where surviving miners and synthetic barmaids hid in fear. The walls were covered in scorch marks and anti-plant graffiti. The crew formulated a plan: override the terraformer core to reset the desert's biome, disrupting the photosynthetic equilibrium of the cactus invaders. But first, they had to get past the sheriff. Sheriff Thorne, a genetically spliced cactus-human hybrid, patrolled the town square astride a solar-powered armadillo. His hat was 6-gallon, his glare deadly. Negotiation failed. The duel was inevitable. In a showdown at high noon, the ChronoComposters used reflective panel cloaks to blind the sheriff's sensors, drawing fire away from the terraformer while initiating a manual override. The override triggered a massive pulse of humidity, rendering the cacti bloated and sluggish. General Spikeworth tried to rally his troops, but they wilted in the artificially induced fog. The town returned to its former dusty silence. A few cacti survived and surrendered, promising to form a peaceful botanical council. 3 disasters corrected, but the chronomutation's roots dug deeper than expected. Orbiting high above Earth's atmosphere in the year 2587, Moon Colony Alpha was the glittering gem of lunar culture. Every year, its citizens held the anti-gravity prom, a zero-G celebration of youth, nostalgia, and poor fashion decisions. This year, it also became the stage for a temporal flora invasion. The ChronoComposters picked up the disturbance via a viral stream. Feeds showing teenagers in neon tuxedos screaming as vines burst from the disco floor. What began as a decorative garden wall for photo ops had turned into a carnivorous plant pit. Somehow, a contaminated bouquet from Earth's chronofield had found its way into the punch. Time had no mercy for nostalgia. Arriving through a concealed maintenance hatch, the crew floated past panicked prom-goers as zero-gravity spores chased down slow dancers. The floral contamination wasn't just alive, it responded to rhythm. The faster the music, the faster it grew. And the DJ, oblivious to the chaos, had just dropped the beat. To contain it, they needed to invert the tempo-based growth response. Using old Earth disco patterns and a hacked soundboard, they recalibrated the rhythm to a decay frequency, essentially forcing the plants into a metabolic sleep. As strobe lights flashed in reverse and the music slowed to an awkward crawl, the vines began to droop. The prom queen floated by, crowned slightly askew, tangled in ivy. With the contamination neutralized, the prom resumed, at a slower pace, with less enthusiasm. One couple even thanked the ChronoComposters for saving prom with science. For disasters down, the beat, thankfully, had stopped. Far from the composted chaos, deep in the citadel of chronoregulation, a single figure stood over a fractured holographic globe. Inspector Chronix, the most feared auditor of the Temporal Bureau, had finally noticed the ripple. He moved with mechanical precision, his synthetic eyes zooming in on multiple points of disruption. History was unraveling, not wildly but cleverly. Someone or something had weaponized waste. Chronix's fingers danced across the hologram, accessing deep time layers. Every anomaly led back to the same crew. The ChronoComposters. Orders were issued. A Class 9 temporal violation warrant. The hunt began. Meanwhile, the crew, unaware of the audit storm approaching, took shelter on a forgotten asteroid fueling station. They were tired, dirty, and running low on compost gel. But peace was not in their compostable cards. The first sign of trouble came with a freeze frame. Time paused for 3 full seconds. Then Chronix's voice echoed across the deck. Your license to clean is hereby revoked. Alarm screamed. System shut down. The inspector had tagged them. But the ChronoComposters had one last defense, the temporal escape mop. Disguised as janitorial equipment, it contained a backup chronodrive. With a hard launch, they vanished into deeper time. They were no longer just janitors. They were fugitives. The temporal escape mop flung the crew into what should have been safe territory. Earth, circa 3050. But what they found was not Earth at all, not as they remembered. The sky was a hazy green. towering vines wrapped around the skeletons of skyscrapers. No signal, no cities, no humans. Only plants. At first, they thought it was another temporal biomutation. But this wasn't chaos. It was structured, orchestrated. The crew's bioscanners picked up a disturbing pattern. Networks of roots communicating like neurons, forming a planetary hive mind. They were intercepted by a patrol of animated bark-covered sentries, riding enormous dragonflies. Taken into custody, they were brought before the Florarchy, a council of intelligent plant overlords who had taken root across Earth's biomes. Among them was an orchid with the voice of an aristocrat, a moss being that communicated through humidity patterns, and a sarcastic fern named Fernando, who took special joy in mocking the flesh bags for their short-sightedness. The Florarchy revealed the truth. Humanity had gone extinct centuries ago, choked by its own waste and replaced by hyper-evolved flora. The final push came from time-scattered compost agents, some of which had carried dormant intelligence. The Earth hadn't been destroyed. It had simply moved on. Now the plants ruled, and they were not happy to see the ChronoComposters. Placed on trial for crimes against temporal ecology, the crew argued their case. But logic failed. The only path to redemption, the Florarchy decreed, was through photosynthetic penance. Assigned to a rehabilitation dome, the crew was forced to cultivate native plants using only ancient, manual tools. No tech, no shortcuts, just dirt, patience, and guilt. Weeks passed. Something shifted. The crew began to understand the rhythm of the world they had tried so hard to clean. Not every mess needed fixing. Some just needed time. When the Florarchy returned, they offered a choice: stay and serve, or leave and finish what they started. The crew chose the latter. The plants let them go, not as a favor, but as a final test. Earth would remain a garden, watched by its green-eyed rulers. But the future? That was still unwritten. Time travel is messy, but war in time? That's pure chaos. The ChronoComposters, now fugitives and reformists, tracked the true source of the corruption to a swirling rift, a collapsed timeline leaking composted anomalies into every age. Inside it, a rogue janitorial unit known as the Temporal Sanitation Syndicate. Led by Captain Grime, a disgraced ex-composter turned timeline profiteer, the syndicate had been using the compost system to create localized biochaos, selling cleanup rights to the highest bidder. Their motto: trash is cash. The crew dove into the rift, entering the eye of the cyclone, where time coiled in on itself. Dinosaurs, pirates, Martian lawyers, and Victorian robots flickered in and out of view. Within this temporal battleground, the final confrontation began. Grime's forces rode mutated compost beasts, oozing, snarling masses of every era's worst organic leftovers. The ChronoComposters, though outnumbered, had one advantage: they knew their own garbage. They activated the reverse digestion protocol, turning the beasts against their masters. Compost recognizes intent, after all. The battle raged across fragments of history. The Eiffel Tower melted into jungle. The Great Wall of China was overtaken by migrating kudzu. Cleopatra and Elon Musk debated taxes over coffee. In the center of the chaos, Captain Grime revealed his ace, a chronosplicer capable of rewriting reality using compost DNA. But the device was unstable. The crew had one shot. They lured Grime's beast into the splicer field and fed it a memory seed, an artifact from their first mission. The paradox triggered a loop collapse. Everything froze. Time blinked. Then silence. The rift began to heal. Slowly, the timelines stitched themselves together, like vines finding a trellis. Captain Grime was gone. His syndicate scattered. The garbage war was over. In the aftermath, the ChronoComposters returned to a world not broken, but changed. Earth had stabilized into a techno-organic equilibrium. Cities were alive, literally. Buildings grown from carbon-hardened wood. Streets paved with flexible moss. Air filtered by genetically enhanced clouds. A new civilization had risen, one that embraced both nature and tech. Compost was no longer waste. It was code, currency, Culture. The Temporal Bureau had been dismantled, its archives absorbed into the RootNet. Inspector Chronics? Reprogrammed into a gardening assistant. The ChronoComposters were offered recognition, fame, even sainthood. But they declined. They weren't heroes, just janitors who cleaned up their own mess. They parked the Filth Falcon in a converted landfill, now known as Harmony Crater, and opened a school, ChronoEco 101. They trained the next generation, not in time travel, but in responsibility. The final scene, the crew standing on a glowing hillside, overlooking a world in bloom. Birds with antennae chirped binary melodies. Trees whispered stock market trends. Somewhere, a baby plant took its first breath in a sunbeam filtered through recycled satellite petals. The ChronoComposters watched, silent. Sometimes, saving the future means making peace with your past and composting it properly.